Hello and welcome to my microphone is not on. Goodness gracious. Here we go. We're live. We're doing this great. Hello and welcome to another edition of the podcast. I am your host for today, Parker Fleming, data scientist at Sumer Sports. And I am here filling in for Eric Eager and Thomas Dimitrov. Again, if you are just tuning in, I am taking over one day a week of the show for the summer, as Eric and Thomas are working hard on bigger picture stuff. I get to do a couple episodes. Tej Seth, when he comes back from his well-deserved graduation tour, he will be on these episodes with me. We'll rotate through some guests. We'll rotate through some ideas, breaking down some football concepts, and we will, like I'm going to do today, do a bunch of different just kind of explorations, mini deep dives on some research and some ideas that we have been working on. So going to going to do that a little bit today, and just kind of go solo and see how this goes, and talk about a work in progress that I have, that is specifically talking about team game plans and how we evaluate game plans and week-to-week game plans and what that reveals about team strength, using data. So I'll show a couple graphs, talk a little bit through that, and explain my thinking there. Before we get to that, a couple just housekeeping things to note. Make sure you're subscribed to the show. Make sure you're following at Sumer Sports on YouTube, on Twitter, Twitch, I believe I'm live on now, Facebook, LinkedIn, all over the place. So make sure you're just following us wherever you get your media, like, rate, review, subscribe. That helps us grow the show, helps us reach the people that would be interested in it, and frankly, helps us build a better community of people who are interested in game-changing and thoughtful applications of data and analytics to NFL, or just to the NFL, or just generally football, specifically. This Saturday, as many of you know, if you follow me on Twitter, the XFL is near and dear to my heart. This weekend, we're going to do something fun. Eric and I are. We're going to live stream during the XFL game. We got set up with playback, and we'll be able to pull up the game. You'll be able to log in, watch the game with us, chat with us, and get that cool experience of kind of watching the XFL championship together. So hopefully that's something that all of you will be excited about. I think that's something Eric and I are very excited about, knowing that most Saturdays we're furiously texting about the XFL. We'll get to watch it with all of you. Should be a lot of fun there. So look out for a link there. Again, if you're following the Sumer Sports Twitter or us on YouTube, you'll see links for all of that for sure. Whew, okay, big time of the year. The draft is over. Last week had a great interview with our data scientist, Quinn McLean. He is responsible for our college to pro projections and did a bunch of works, trying to figure out how do we meaningfully translate people's performance from their college careers to their fit at the NFL level. Great interview. Make sure you check that out if you haven't. That's on YouTube as well. But we're in a little bit of a lull. The schedule hasn't come out. If you're listening to this live, we're waiting on the NFL schedule. There's only so much we can do after the draft. Now that we have the rookies, we know where they are, know what the teams are going to look like, but we can't do a lot without the schedules, and so we're waiting on that. Certainly, the draft has happened. Teams are not ready to report, not ready to do offseason workouts. So a little bit of a lull here. This is kind of a fun time because you can dive in. We're tweaking our models, dusting off some stuff we used last year. I know I personally am going through a lot of college and NFL data to figure out, all right, what do I want to improve? What do I want to iterate? What can I automate so that I can breathe a little bit during the season, now that I'll be doing NFL stuff as well as college stuff? And one of those things that I've been thinking a lot about is game plans. If you've seen any kind of my previews, you'll know that I'm pulling them up. I should have had that prepared. I apologize. I forget that we're on the audio as well, or the video as well as the audio. So I was going to talk through it. If you have seen any of my previews that I'm pulling up right here, you'll know that I'm really interested in kind of the whole idea of selection, specifically selection and how it affects teams, and how they game plan, right? How am I going to attack this team based on what I see from them? So you've got the preview up here. You can see that in the window, just a little bit. And again, so we like to break things down and say I like to look at the EPA per pass, the EPA per rush, how often a team rushes on early downs, rush rate over expected. Down here in the corner, and their third and fourth down, success rate and average third and fourth down distance, kind of a good way to compare between the two teams to get a measure of style, to get a measure of how they attack and who they attack in the NFL. So what I like to do and what I've been thinking about recently is how I can do this on a little bit more of a systematic level, not just looking at game plans based on an individual matchup, but looking at a team all over the course of a season, how they change their game plan and what that says about their team strength and about perhaps their team identity. So I'm going to frame a lot of this using a drop back rate over expected model. I know on these previews that you see here and that you've seen on Twitter, I've used rush rate over expected. I think it's a little less clunky to call it a drop back rate over expected. And so I'm going to frame it as that going forward. And a drop back rate over expected just says, I want to know how often a team passes, but I know that game state really influences how often a team can pass. So what we can do is account for down, distance, yard line, score differential, because that certainly matters, to say how often over the course of the NFL data does an NFL team pass in certain situations. And then we can say how often does this team pass relative to that. And what does that tell us about what this team is going to be, how we should expect them to move the ball, and predictively, how do we expect that to go forward? So I'm going to share a screen again, because I'm going to look at just basic offense and defense, rushing and passing here. Let me make sure that I have this preview. Allow. Great. Apologies for my technological difficulties and figuring out how to share a screen. Okay, stop sharing. This is great audio for all of you podcast listeners. Okay, as I'm pulling that up and trying to get that on the YouTube here, really what we want to look at is which teams passed the most in 2022. If that's a question that we're interested in knowing, we have to account for dropback rate over expected, and we have to account for dropback rates, absolute dropback rate. So when we look at these, obviously a good metric is going to tell us which teams pass the most free of situation. The Chiefs are minus 2.1 percentage points in dropback rate over expected. So in 2022, Kansas City passed the most. They led the league. They were expected to drop back on 56.3% of their dropbacks. In reality, they did drop back on 54.2% of their dropbacks, which was all plays with at least 10% win probability and no more than 90% win probability. So kind of normal football there. And the Chiefs were the most. They were followed right behind by the Bengals, who were minus 4.8 percentage points. They had an expected dropback rate of 58.5 and an expected dropback rate, or an actual dropback rate of 53.7. Then the Bills came in next, followed by the Buccaneers, Chargers, Dolphins, Vikings, and Jaguars. Kind of rounded out the top 8. On the other side, the Bears were expected to drop back 66% of their dropbacks. A lot of that has to do with the fact that they were very bad and they were down by a lot, and you would expect them to pass a lot more if they were down by a lot more. And they only dropped back on 41.2% of their 41.2% of their plays, which is minus 24.8 percentage points. That was the most run heavy team in the league there. With such a big gap, they were closely followed by Falcons, Titans, Panthers, Saints, Washington, the Browns, and the LA Rams. So you can see that there is a little bit of a dichotomy of the good teams are being a little more aggressive in passing, and the bad teams are not being as aggressive in passing. And certainly that there's a couple things that when we're talking about game plan and how a team might attack, we have to account for. So one, there's an obvious example, an obvious problem of endogeneity. If I have Pat Mahomes, I'm more comfortable in passing and I'm more comfortable passing consistently. I can do that more often. And so in any given marginal situation, I'm going to be more likely to throw a pass than I would if I don't have Pat Mahomes, right? Pretty straightforward there. On the flip side, if I have a Justin Fields or a Desmond Ridder or an offensive line like the Titans, I'm going to be a little more reluctant to pass. I'm going to be a little more reliant on my run game. And so it's not just as simple as pass more good, run more bad. The selection issue of the talent is going to matter a whole lot in kind of how a team is able to attack. But run and pass rates, I think, are very important because the NFL is a game of matchups, right? So it's not just that you passed 2.1 percentage points less than the average team in a given situation. It's how did you do that from week to week? And how much did you change that from week to week overall, given the fact that you passed a certain way? So what I'm leading up here to is moving from a expected dropback rate or a dropback rate over expectation and moving into a relative dropback rate over expectation. So when I'm talking about game plans, it's less about the absolute reality of did you pass more or run more. It's more so, did you pass more or run more relative to how much you pass or run in any given situation across all situations, across all opponents. So we can look at a relative rush rate over expected, a relative dropback rate over expected. And that gives me a week-to-week metric that informs how well or how different a team approached their matchups on any given week. So I'm going to take a beat for a second. I'm gonna get the technology right here and pull up this graph that's not showing up because I think it's really important that we look at this and we can talk about game plan variance and how that relates to offensive efficiency. So I'm going to pull up a share screen. I'm going to pull up preview. I'm going to allow it. And it does not appear that it's allowing me to share this screen, which is just extremely fun. Let's try one more thing. I'm going to try. And if that doesn't work, then we might just have to go to an all audio podcast, and that's okay. Share screen, allow. There we go. Okay, great. Sorry for a little bit of technical difficulties there. I think this should work. Nope, that didn't work. Let's try it again. One thing I can assure you is that the Sumer Sports podcast will not be this technologically deficient throughout the summer as Tej and I are doing it. Again, apologies for that. Let's get this where we can see it. Okay, so what we've got now is just an entire metric that looks at game plan variance and offensive efficiency. And I'll explain what I mean by game plan variance. So game plan variance is simply going to be the variance of your relative rush rate from week to week against every opponent. What this tells me is how often a team changes their game plan on a week-to-week basis. If their game plan variance is high, that means that their relative rush rate, their relative dropback rate over expected is volatile. It moves a whole lot, indicating that they are chasing matchups, indicating that they are responding to what the defense gives them, indicating that they are flexible and trying to move a lot. If it doesn't change week to week, it kind of says, all right, this is your identity for better or worse. And so we can talk about what that means with teams in a what I think is a meaningful way here, as again, video essay kind of fleshing out this research here. So let's start with offensive game plan variance over and offensive efficiency. That's what this graph is. Again, lower variance is no change in week-to-week game plan, kind of on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we have, those teams that are more volatile from week to week. And we have EPA per play, offensive EPA per play on the y-axis. So what's really interesting about this is you get a very nice kind of U shape. It's not monotonic. There are teams that are bad on offense and they don't change their efficiency very much. So Denver last year, for instance, struggled a whole lot, couldn't really get a lot going. They were about negative 0.75 EPA per play, which is, fifth or sixth in the league. And they were one of the teams that changed their week to week run philosophy or run pass mix the least. So they didn't feel, I think there's a narrative there. We can say, looking at this team, low change in week to week variance, low offensive EPA per play. What that gets me is a picture of a team that was not able to adapt and kind of felt this is the only thing we're comfortable doing. We're going to have to keep trying it until it works. On the exact opposite of that, you can see the Carolina dot all the way out to the right. Again, a team that struggled on offense. Again, below that negative 0.05 EPA per play mark, but the highest variance in week-to-week game plan. The Carolina didn't have that strong sense of identity, felt like they needed to try a lot of things to get them to work, and didn't necessarily get those things to work in a meaningful way. So again, kind of two pictures of offenses that struggled last year. Denver doesn't change a lot. Carolina does change a whole lot. And both of them struggled. Nothing really worked for either of them. As we kind of move through the offenses, we can point out some offenses that did better or worse, or had what I would say are ideological quirks that I think stand out. And again, the data shows us this really nicely. Tennessee is another great example. They had the second largest shift from week to week game plan of anyone in the conference. They were kind of in the middle of league. They were in the middle of efficiency, EPA per play on offense, and they changed a whole lot. That is due to there's a couple injuries on the offensive line. The passing game was kind of inconsistent. Josh Dobbs started a game for them. And they want to ride, Derrick Henry, their big running back. As he's able to take the load, as teams deny the run, the Titans had to switch their game plan dramatically. So back and forth, but they had a little bit better returns than Carolina. You can see that the Titans very much had to kind of respond to what they wanted to do and respond to what defenses gave them to get any success on the offensive side of the ball. On the flip side of the Titans, you have Dallas, an EPA just above 0.05. And all the way there on the left side of the graph, they actually changed their game plan the least. They knew what they wanted to do. They knew their strengths, and they felt like they could execute them against each opponent. So their game plan, and again, this is not X's and O's, right? Obviously, those are going to change. Obviously, the specific matchups are going to change. But what this is telling me is that Dallas was able to create the matchups that it wanted against a lot of different opponents. And that's one of the most interesting findings I think we have from this kind of initial state of research is there's these continuums of teams, and Dallas is a team that was able to consistently find matchups without having to change their relative rush rate over expectation, change the rate at which they ran or passed given any situation. There again, this U shape, we're kind of working our way up to the top of the U. We'll end with the Super Bowl teams, but you get kind of this foursome in the middle here that stands out. This Buffalo, San Francisco, Cincinnati, Detroit. Buffalo is a little closer to Kansas City, a little closer to Dallas there. A very efficient offense, almost 0.15 EPA per play, one of the best in the league, second or third there. And they are in the top third of teams that didn't change their identity. So again, Buffalo knew exactly what they wanted to do with Josh Allen, felt like they could consistently create those matchups, and didn't have to shift their run pass balance much, accounting for situation, to try and generate some offense, make something different happen, right? There was really, we have a strong identity. We know what we want to do, and we can consistently create that matchup. On the flip side of Buffalo, again, moving kind of back and forth across the graph, Philadelphia, closer to the larger shift of things. Super Bowl team, had a great rushing attack with Jalen Hurts at quarterback, had, Devonta Smith and AJ Brown downfield, just so many weapons. And you really see Philadelphia stand out as this Swiss Army knife team. Again, the only information I have here is how often they ran and passed, right? Given down distance and situation. And so this leads me to believe, hey, Philadelphia, I have an empirical confirmation of the level to which your offense was versatile, right? Because again, if you are changing a lot of things and you're not doing great, Carolina, you're struggling. If you're changing a lot of things and you are doing great, then you're versatile, right? So Philadelphia's earned that kind of Swiss Army knife take here, being one of the top three efficient offenses, and then being the fourth most volatile, highest variance game plan offense week to week, right? And so again, different styles. It's not necessarily better or worse. Philadelphia can create those different matchups, do all that different stuff because they have those options. Buffalo doesn't need necessarily to be that versatile. They can still be really efficient, almost efficient as Philadelphia, with without having to change, without having to potentially get to a lot of those different guys. In the middle, before we get to Kansas City, of course, the outlier on any graph, the Mahomes graphs, if you will, San Francisco and Kansas City, or excuse me, San Francisco and Cincinnati and Detroit were all kind of here in the middle. What I find interesting about this is they're very middle of the road. Again, Cincinnati was one of the most pass heavy teams, right behind Kansas City in terms of dropback rate over expectation, but they really got the run game involved when they needed to enough. And so what this says to me and about San Francisco, especially given, talking about San Francisco having Brock Purdy, having to get a little creative down the stretch, I'm sure there's variation over time for San Francisco in this. What we see here is a little bit more of a dimensionality to teams that potentially didn't have that dimensionality in the past. So Cincinnati is able to have a little bit more robust of a run game when they need it. They're able to find and isolate those matchups when they need it, and that improves their efficiency, right? There's a little bit to suggest with this kind of U shape here that as you move towards the middle, you kind of get towards the top. Although I will argue where Kansas City and Buffalo are, that's going to be a little bit skewed as to being heavier and having that strong sense of identity. And Philadelphia is a little bit more of an outlier there. Again, just 2022 data. But we go to, Kansas City, most pass heavy team in the league and most efficient offense in the league by a wide margin. And really, again, in that top third of not changing their game plan. We saw in the playoffs, for instance, when Pacheco got so involved, but they had some ideas about what they could do if they needed to do something different. But for the most part, Mahomes to Kelsey and then the wide receivers kind of looked, they said, we're going to pass. We're not going to change the structure of our offense. We're going to create matchups through alignment. We're going to create matchups through our guys having space, through Pat Mahomes being able to extend plays. And so again, you get this kind of nice contrast of the teams that were good and how they were good because they needed to be versatile, or they were good because they had a strong sense of their identity. So again, as little information as possible here, just down distance, yard line, game state. How often does a team run or pass relative to how often they run or pass in every other given situation? And what this gives us is an idea of some potential structure to returns in varying your game plan, right? There are different paths you can go. You could be Philadelphia if you can be that versatile, and you can boost your efficiency by changing your game plan a lot. You can also be Kansas City or Buffalo and have a very strong sense of your identity, not change it, and still be very, very good. The guys on the outlier, the teams on the outside here, the Tennessees, the Carolinas, the Dallases, the Minnesotas is one I didn't point out, but they're right there next to Dallas. Those teams potentially on the low end, increasing their game plan efficiency, or on the upper end, decreasing their game efficiency. Decreasing their game plan variance, not efficiency, could increase their efficiency either way. Again, why I'm so excited about this in this preliminary stage is that already starts to lay out, okay, why doesn't Dallas have a little bit more volatility between the run and the pass game relative to what they normally do? Do they need to draft in a way that could address one of those issues? Opens up all kinds of things in relief where you can talk about a discrepancy in offensive and defensive, in offensive efficiency between the run and the pass game. How do they attack that? Are they game planning well? Right. And again, game planning is so much deeper, so much broader than running and passing rates only. But it does tell me a lot about matchups and what matchups a team felt like they could attack over the course of the game, especially in relief to each other. So interesting on offense can give us an idea of how a team attacked and where they might be able to optimize by increasing the versatility of how they attack, or getting a stronger identity and decreasing perhaps the erratic nature of their offense there. And you could start to ask, how can they supplement their play, how can they supplement their team to be able to increase that versatility or have that stronger sense of identity. I'm going to switch over and talk about defense just for a little bit. We'll probably get close to 30-ish minutes here. I don't want to ramble too long. If you're here and in the comments and have questions or thoughts about this research, would love for this to be back and forth a little bit. Would be happy to address that and flesh this out. I know that unfinished research is always interesting to publish, and this is just very much some foundational ideas here. So if you've got thoughts, if you've got questions, please feel free to toss those in the comments, and I will absolutely spend some time addressing them. All right, I'm going to attempt again to remove that from the stream and see if I can open the defensive version of this chart. Look at that. Look at that. And I can add that to the stream. That was so easy. That was much better than the other time. Okay, so here, defense, we've got a very interesting, almost like a Rorschach test here of what do you see when you look at this picture. But again, we've got how much does an offense change its rush rate, relative dropback rate versus you, and how good was your defense? So again, very interesting here to see, again, kind of a U shape. And we'll point out the outliers. I won't spend as long on these as I did the offensive one, but you kind of have 4 quadrants. So these teams that are in the bottom left hand are teams that were bottom left quadrant are teams that offenses didn't change their game plan variant, didn't have a high game plan variance against them. And these defenses were very bad. So Las Vegas, Green Bay, Detroit, Minnesota, Seattle, even Miami, close to right there. And Arizona are kind of in that quadrant. And so what we see here is that these teams, you really don't have to do very much to exploit them. You can do what you want to do against these teams. You can kind of it's not taking what they give you, it's giving them what they'll take, right? And saying, hey, we can kind of run our game against these teams. So these teams here, in this quadrant, were more of the, you can attack them and run your game and get your reps in, and you'll be fine. And so matchups maybe don't matter. These are teams that if we're again thinking about a weak link style of football, which is something we think about a lot here at Sumer, and you should read the article by Eric Eager over on The Zone on sumersports.com about the weak link theory of football. But these guys have multiple weak links, and you can exploit multiple weak links. And it's not like they have one area that you can just attack and get one matchup. It's more so you can run your game against them. We go to the bottom right quadrant here. So these are teams that have high game plan variance against and low defensive efficiency. That's going to be Tennessee, Pittsburgh, the Rams, New York Giants, Jacksonville, Cleveland, and Houston. Those are going to be teams that struggled on defense and potentially had just one fatal flaw, one matchup you could exploit to kind of stretch out that defense, to push them in different directions, and really, create what you want out of that. So again, these are a little more matchup centric, saying these are the teams that they were doing worse on offense. They were doing worse on defense because what you could do against them was find an angle, find an edge, change things up a little bit, and really spread out that defense and make them thin. In the top, we'll just kind of keep going counterclockwise here. In the top right of this chart, again, we have teams that are high game plan variance against and high defensive efficiency. Good defenses there. So Carolina, Baltimore, New Orleans, Kansas City, New England, all up here in this quadrant. Those are teams where they executed well, and they created a matchup problem in such a way that their opponents felt like they had to change what they were doing to attack those teams better. So an opponent saw a New England or a New Orleans and thought, okay, we can't just line up and run our game against them. We've got to do what we want, but they had very varying returns to trying to be creative or potentially moving that around. Some of these that are interesting, I think, at Flag, New England being in this high game plan variance. I wonder if weather doesn't have something to do with that. You think about, hey, it's very cold. That's kind of an outlier, and potentially teams are going to run a lot more against New England. Something like that might be baked into this as we flesh these numbers out and think about this long term. And then this top left quadrant are good defenses who there was low game plan variance against here. So Washington, Tampa Bay, Indianapolis, New York Jets, Buffalo, the Chargers, all these teams, offenses, or excuse me, opposing offenses did not feel like they had a specific edge. There wasn't necessarily that weak link they could exploit. They just tried to run their game, do the same thing, do what we do well. And these defenses were able to stop it. So kind of a two-dimensional picture that actually gives us a lot more information here about the offenses and defenses, how they attack, what they do week to week to attack, and kind of how successful they were. Again, this gives us a ton of information, a really great launching point here to figure out, do we need a do we have an idea of, by looking at this variance in drop back rate over expected, do we have a better picture of what teams had weak links, what teams felt like they had matchup advantages? Again, really nice in relief. And so just an interesting project. One other way we can look at this that's really nice, let me remove this while I change this, is so for instance, if I look at one specific team and I'll look at offense here, let's look at, stay on page. Let's not do that. Hold on. Great. And I can add this back. So if I just look at one team here, this is Cincinnati's 2022 season, the Bengals. And on the bottom, we have our weeks, right? And on the top, we have our drop back rate over expected. So you can see them kind of throughout the week, or throughout the year, they go kind of an increasing trend as they move across weeks and into the playoffs, and then against Kansas City there at the end. This is potentially one way to visualize their season, and almost kind of a strength of schedule metric, because if you're able to pass a lot more, you're probably winning, getting up early, playing a bad defense. And so a little bit of a measure of strength of schedule here by how far above you are on these metrics. But then again, just a kind of visual representation to say, over the course of the season, there's going to be a lot of variance, right? There's going to be kind of a sawtooth against different opponents. You're going to behave differently. And the run pass mix is just one very, very, very small part of game plans. But by looking at game plan efficiency and game plan variance and how it relates to efficiency, we can start to isolate matchups. We can start to isolate what went wrong, potentially what might be outliers that we can factor in if we're trying to be predictive and understanding the game. I know, for the example right on this one, this Atlanta game, I do believe Atlanta was playing a couple backups at corner. And so Cincinnati was aware of that, right? In their game plan, they said, okay, we know we're going to attack, we're going to push. And that was their highest drop back rate over expected of all the season. So again, kind of a nice way. And you might say, Parker, I know that. I watch ball. I know what's going on here. And that's great. But what this allows us to do is systematically isolate games, or systematically identify games where a team felt they had a specific edge, and perhaps control for that to say, all right, in a predictive sense, if they didn't have that edge, how do we account for that increase in efficiency against that Atlanta team that's playing a backup cornerback? How does that tell us about how they're going to do against the rest of their schedule, and factor that in as we understand the game? Okay, that was a lot of talking and a lot of half-brained research. I'm really appreciate the time and the space to be able to talk about this. I hope this was interesting. We'll have guests in the future and continue to talk about other harebrained football ideas that I think are smart, and think about how we think about the game. So again, really, really enjoyed this. Just an opportunity to lay out some ideas that I'm working on. There's so many cool things we're working on at Sumer, and so many of them we can only show just a little bit out there. So happy to show some of these, and I'll tweet some of these graphs as well, so that those of you that are listening to the audio can see them, and we can talk about them there as well. Let me check. I've got a couple comments here that I'll hit before I'm done, before I'm out. William Jones, friend of the show. Glad you're in here, man. Fascinating game plans. I think that's a very interesting question. So William Jones is asking about the thoughts on game plan consistency of teams that play multiple times in a year. So if we look at this Cincinnati graph, they played Baltimore 3 times. Let me put this up here, right? This is a great example. And I'm actually going to make this bigger just so we can see this a little better. They played Baltimore 3 times. The first time they played Baltimore in week 5, they were not very aggressive. They basically just did what they felt like the situation dictated, almost a zero drop back rate over expected. The second time they played, very aggressive. One of their top four most aggressive games. The third time they played, again, still very aggressive in the top, I think, 6 or 8 games that they played. But yeah, I think if you could start to link these together and think about how they approach multiple meetings, that's an area that's really, really ripe for potential research, and potentially, in these situations where you might have to play a team back to back, and like Cincinnati did in the playoffs, and in the regular season. I think there's a whole lot there that you could do, and kind of, we're just barely scratching the surface here with looking at this. But yeah, it's a great question, and really interesting, and certainly an avenue that I've thought about, even if I haven't fully fleshed out there. So great. I think that's going to do it for me. I can only talk so much, even though I can talk very, very fast. Appreciate you listening in. Make sure you like, subscribe, rate, review, all that stuff that helps us out here on the show as we continue to bring great content. Next week will be 1 week of me with a special guest that I think will be pretty awesome. And potentially some content that you guys have not seen on the internet, which is cool. And then Eric Eaker and Thomas Dimitrov will be back to break down football, break down the process, talk about all that. So make sure you're following on Twitter. Make sure you're following on YouTube so you don't miss any of that. And Saturday night, XFL Championship live stream. Going to be a lot of fun. I have no idea what it's going to entail, but Eric and I are going to watch some ball and talk about it and break it down, and we'd love to have you with us. So you can find, I'll post that link on Twitter when we have it live for all of you to join in. This has been the Sumer Sports Show. I am Parker Fleming, and I will see all of you again next week.